This podcast was created using Anchor. Anchor is the free podcast platform that allows you or anyone to set up and start your own podcast free of charge so that your voice is heard. It's because they believe in the democratization of audio, pure and simple. That's why I use their platform. Anchor.fm or the Anchor app will get you there. Hey everyone, this is Rumble and I'm Michael Moore. Welcome back. I told you yesterday you'd hear from me within 24 hours and here I am. I've sort of decided, I think what we need to do, our weekly podcast, remember that's what we officially started out doing back on December 17th. For right now, during this crisis, we're going to do this on a daily basis, or at least 5 days a week during the weekdays, and maybe we'll do one on the weekends, but at least I'm going to commit to I'll be in your inbox, or it'll be on your platform, or however you're notified of this podcast. By midnight Eastern time each night, we will have posted the next episode. This is episode 59. And on today's episode, I have with me one of the great American thinkers of our time, an esteemed economist, author, professor. He teaches in the Department of Public Affairs. He teaches economics and government and history at the University of Texas in Austin. I'm very honored to have him with me here today, the wonderful and much needed right now, James Galbraith. His books include Inequality and Instability, The Predator State, and The End of Normal. His father was the renowned economist John Kenneth Galbraith. He was a singular force, working from the time of President Franklin Roosevelt all the way through the Kennedy and I think into the Johnson administrations in the 60s. His ideas helped to shape the New Deal, the New Frontier, and a new way of trying to act as Americans, starting with during the Depression and World War II and afterward. His son is no less prominent and no less important to us right now. But first, let me say that I'm very happy to announce that we have another new underwriter for this podcast. So we're very happy and proud to have ExpressVPN join us. ExpressVPN stands, VPN, if you are not tech savvy, stands for Virtual Private Network, and allows you to protect your privacy and your security when you're online. And some of the people in our last film, when we were working on the film, used this. And, we have to, when we're making a movie, especially the kind of movies I make, you have to be kind of careful so that the right or the wrong people don't find out what you're up to. And ExpressVPN it's sort of the premier group that does this very thing. Let me just say this. The huge tech companies in this country, they pay next to nothing in taxes, meaning that they barely give anything back to the society that has made them rich. How do they get rich? By using your personal data and selling it. And when they grab this and sell it off to the highest bidder, they get wealthy and you have your privacy violated. So ExpressVPN, they can block this from happening. It encrypts all of your data so that it's protected from hackers and anybody else that's trying to possibly check up on you. And I'm so happy that they've decided that they want to underwrite this show so that this podcast can come to you, and I thank them for doing this. In return, they are going to have this offer. If you sign up for like a 1-year thing with them, they'll make the first 3 months free when you go to them at ExpressVPN. So that's Express, like the express train, ExpressVPN.com, and go /Rumble when you type that in, and you'll get 3 months free. ExpressVPN.com/Rumble. $96-0. That sunk me last week. The Senate vote to give how many trillions, I'm not sure of, to the 1%, corporate America, Wall Street, cruise ships. I don't know who's getting it, but James, that just really sunk me. I don't know how you felt about it, but
it's going to the people who own stock and the people who have hold the bonds of these companies. But while it will keep them out of bankruptcy for a period of time, it's fundamentally not going to change the reality, which is that I don't think very many people are going to get on cruise ships for a long time after this experience. And I suspect that the airline industry will not see a return of customers.
Right.
And so we're essentially allowing the owning class in these industries to escape with fewer losses than they might otherwise have experienced. But the world is going to be changed by this in ways which we've only, I think, just begun to grasp, and that no amount of bailing out the industries can stop.
Right, because how do you bail out the human mind that says, don't get on a cruise ship? Or
right, exactly. Of course, that's a minor case, and those ships are not registered in the United States, and it's a scandal that they're bailed out in the first place.
Right.
They have been evaders of U.S. regulations and labor standards and everything else for many, many years. But the airline industry is another thing. We've become very accustomed to a lot of international travel. And how do you persuade people that destinations are safe when there's something like this has happened? It's going to be a long time.
And it is going to be a long time. Dr. Zeke Emanuel, who spent many years at the NIH and now runs the public health division there, the University of Pennsylvania, and he has said, and nobody wants to hear this, and I understand why they don't, that this is at least a 2-year pandemic. The virus will never truly leave, just like I mentioned in yesterday's podcast that the bubonic plague is actually still with us. There's about 1,000 cases a year, but we have medicine and treatments and things like that where it doesn't spread, and people survive it. But the plague has been with us for I don't know what 500 plus years now. So I don't want to get on a plane anytime soon. I don't. Even after we're through the first wave of this, he said this is going to go for 2 years, and it's going to be a series of it's going to peak, and then it'll go down, and then we can come out of the house for a few months until it comes back. And then we got to go back in the house until it dies down, which it will. And each time it'll get weaker. And maybe by the third wave of it, we'll be fairly safe. Nonetheless, our life as we knew it is completely altered at this point.
I think that's entirely plausible, that we existed in a world where we did not take this kind of thing into account. We now exist in a world where we have to take it into account. And the task is always going to be to make sure that to try to make sure that we have the adequate medical capacity and the adequate capacity to get, as a social matter, to get through these periods when we have to shelter in place, when we have to do what we're doing now. And we are only beginning to confront the task of getting organized in order to do that. And we're much less well prepared, much less well set up than societies which have organized themselves differently. I mean, it's clear that while the Chinese had a bit of a slow start, they were able to mobilize the entire population. They were able to enforce a quarantine, and they were able to keep people supplied. So they were able to come through this, suppress the virus. Obviously, it's a continuing risk, in China as everywhere, but they were able then to begin to bring back the crucial capacities, medical supplies, that they're now producing and shipping all over the world. And this is only in a matter of months, but they were extremely well organized to do that. What we have done, and it really is a product of the neoliberal era, of the era of free market economics since the late 1970s, is we've stretched our supply lines. We constantly minimized costs, constantly put things out to where we could get the cheapest and fastest sourcing of things. And as a result, things were in fact provided in this country very efficiently and very inexpensively by comparison with what they could be. It's also a very fragile system, subject to disruption, and it is being disrupted. And we're going to discover the consequences of not having the reserve capacity. And we have to get organized very quickly to restore that, or we're going to suffer even more. And there are lots of aspects of this, medical supply chains, but also, I would say, food and basic medicines. And these things have to be really change the way we think about what's essential in our lives.
When you say we've done this, the system we've created has been created based on trying to get things cheaply, quickly, and of course we're always sold that this is the best way because they pass that cheap cost on to us, the consumer, and so we get to buy a lot of crap. Sorry, it's not all crap. I am happy to have this iPhone. I will admit that. It performs a function for me. Nonetheless, I'm on an iPhone 7. I never believed that you should be buying, you got to get the 8 because it's the 8's out now. Got to get the 9 because the iPhone 9's out now. Now it's the 11, but at some point the 7 doesn't work, and you got to get the next one. I mean, how would you describe this system that we've built, this consumer culture that we've created? And that's only one piece of this, because there's other things I don't consider part of that consumer excess, or the way that we live on having to buy the next great thing just to have the next great thing. There are things that we, like you said, the basic things to survive, the food distribution system, how we make grow our food, make it, distribute it, how we transport ourselves is important. I'm not a big fan of the airlines, but nonetheless, how are we going to get from A to B? It seems so overwhelming to me, and I want you to explain this, I guess, to people listening. Explain it to me. I have a high school education.
Many of these things will have to be reconsidered and redesigned. I could start compiling a list, and I could only come up with a few examples, but you think of all the service establishments that we have, restaurants, which are typically very crowded. They're crowded because that gives the restaurant a chance to have more customers and to cover its costs. If you implement social distancing, even when you open up the restaurants, they're going to be able to handle many fewer people. Question is, are they viable? That's going to cause us to rethink how we do that kind of food delivery, I imagine. We think about all the things that involve crowds, and just to think about concerts and political and any kind of big crowd event.
Movie theaters.
These things are going to have to be, first of all, they have to be held off for quite a period of time, to think about alternative ways to have those kinds of enriching cultural experiences, or fun for that matter, and if they do come back, they're going to have to come back very carefully, so that we have all kinds of capacities that we haven't. We're going to need. We're going to need people to monitor and check people's health status in the way that we have not had, in order to maintain control of this. Once we get it under control in the first place, if we can manage that much.
What do you mean by that? Do you mean like if you want to go to the theater, they're going to have to take your temperature at the door, including
absolutely every building you walk into in China, someone takes your temperature. Absolutely.
So we're going to have to do that for a while.
Well, if we don't get it done, we're going to end up with more outbreaks and more shelter in place than we might otherwise be able to get away with. Testing is obviously something we've botched badly. So far, we don't have adequate testing, but when we get the testing capacity up, then we're going to need people to staff and manage the testing operations, and that's going to be a large-scale, ongoing activity. So one can think about all kinds of things where we're going to have work that people need to do. But even before that, as we go through this, we think about all of these people who are really the worst treated workers in our society. People who are checkout clerks or stockers or security guards, or people who work in the warehouses and do the package things and ship. All of these people are now the most essential workers we have after healthcare workers. They are the ones we're relying on to keep us supplied and to keep everybody calm and in their houses during this period. And we need to pay them more. We need to protect them medically. We need to cover their medical costs. So again, one is only beginning to think about the kind of reorganization that we need to have to put the core values back where they need to be. And I'm not going to derogate, people's consumption preferences and so forth in the ordinary sphere of things. That will change some. But we've also had an economy that is called the Plutonomy, which is a large share of consumption being essentially directed to a very small share of the population with extraordinarily wealthy. And the whole design of the high-end housing and the kinds of goods that have been going into that's also going to be problematic.
So those things. That is the Plutonomy, just for people so they understand what you mean by that. The Plutonomy.
It just means an economy driven by the consumption habits of very rich people. It's actually a term that was invented, I think, by economists at Citibank, and it's a rather good one at describing the way the economy has been oriented toward the extremely wealthy. Now, let me come back to another point, though, because it's really, perhaps before we get there, we're going to have to go through a major decision about what to do about all people's debts. And this is going to be the financial crisis, but on a very much larger scale. People have been piling up debts heavily, of course, in the course of this expansion: student debt and credit card debt and automobile debt and housing debt, every kind of debt. And corporations have been piling up a lot of debt, and by or to a substantial extent, because that's a way to get money to buy back their stock and keep their stock prices up. And as income falls and revenue falls, and even if people are, first of all, the first thing that has to happen is that we keep people sheltered. Their bills are going to have to be deferred, mortgages, their rent, their utility bills, and there can't be any evictions or foreclosures or utility stoppages. That has to be stopped, or otherwise we're not going to be able to deal with the health problem. And then when we start up again, those incomes are not going to come back to cover those debts. So those debts are going to have to be resolved. And if they're not resolved, the people who have made money in this crisis are going to come and snatch up properties, and you're going to have hedge funds buying houses on a scale never before seen. It already started after the last crisis. This kind of thing is going to be a social decision we have to make. Do you want the society to become essentially armies of people who are out on the street? It will not last that way. So that has to be dealt with. The right way to think about it is this is a war, and in a war, allies do not charge each other for the costs of the war. You have to make sure that those debts, in fact, are forgiven. And then we can reset the whole financial system. But that's going to be a very big political decision, which would require since a come to Jesus moment on both political parties, because they have not really been able to face it yet. Many of them, of course, being paid by the people on the other side,
by the people who are are owed the money, and when they want their money.
Yeah, sure. And this. Think about, for example, our Secretary of the Treasury. He was the guy who turned IndyMac into a foreclosure mill.
Right.
This cannot be allowed to happen again.
There's a good chance he will get another 4 years. I mean, I'm sorry to have to say that out loud. Let me spit on the ground. There we go. All right.
There's always been that possibility.
Yeah. How do we get through this? How do we get through this? Seriously, how will we ever recover from this if he's in the White House for 4 more years?
Well, that's a problem we would have to face if we have to face it. The crucial question is right now is, will there be a viable Democratic Party alternative? It's not obvious to me that even though he's in a commanding position so far, that there will be a majority of delegates for Joe Biden when
Right.
convention time come. And of course, it's not obvious. In fact, it's pretty clear that there won't be a convention in the traditional sense,
Right.
Because you can't bring all of the leadership of a political party to one place and put them in close quarters for 3 days under these circumstances. It's obviously impossible. So thinking about how we're going to proceed,
I could designate a few of them that I know. I would have them there.
we can say that as the Mikado, they'll surely not be missed. But let's
right. I wish no ill on anyone at this point.
Nobody would wish that. But in any event, it's clearly not going to happen in either party. Obviously, the Republicans will do what they're going to do, but the Democrats have to face a number of challenges about this particular situation. And
what are they? What do the Democrats have to face head on right now?
Right now, I mean, the party is divided. The leading candidate has obvious questions about his capabilities. It seems to me that when you're looking at effective leadership in this crisis, you need to have people who are on the front lines, who are dealing with it, who have leadership capacity, who are in touch with the real world, and who are expressing and carrying out the values that we know are important. Now, there are such people. They are emerging. But the fact is they're not going to emerge out of the United States Senate. They're going to emerge from the governors because those are the people who are able to show leadership right now. And we really have to rethink what we're going to do what the Democrats have to think what they're going to do as a party, because they're clearly on a path that is exceedingly dangerous. And if you have 2 candidates out there who are extremely doubtful in capacity, the fact is that the federal government cannot be held together for another 4 years. In any recognizable form. If the federal government is not held together, the country will not stay together in any serious way. I mean, we're really looking at already a major shift to the state level in terms of where the leadership is, and someone has to come out of that in order to take control of the whole country and make the federal government function effectively. That is what happened in 1933. Governor of New York came out of the state administration where he'd been dealing with the Depression for 4 years, and he took control of the national government. And he had a team which had imagination and administrative capacity, and he was able to raise that to the federal level and get things going in a way that was addressed to the actual problems, and it was not subservient to the financial interests that had failed. We have much less time to achieve the same effect. But that's the task for us now.
All right. So for, the people who are listening to this podcast and, they have the everyday work-a-day job, and they're at home, they've been furloughed, they've been laid off. They've had no word, first of all, that their health insurance is going to continue. They will get unemployment insurance, but they don't know if a month from now they'll still have health care. Just that one thing, I've heard that from so many people. They're so, of all the times that you might need your health insurance, it would be right now. And for people to be, they're in this terror. They're in this place of terror that their insurance now runs out because they're unemployed, and something happens. And I know the federal government said, we're going to take care of anybody who gets this virus, but there's no piece of paper. I haven't seen anything that will assure people that if they get sick, and plus you're going to have to prove that it was the virus too. You know how the insurance companies are. What if you're in for some kind of heart failure? What if you're in for something else? And then you have no health insurance. It's just
Absolutely. If the hospitals have no capacity, they have no capacity for anything. And people, of course, have many healthcare demands at this point. And if they have no income and they have no insurance, this is a blockage. And the insurance companies are having difficulty dealing with the demands that they, even from the people who are insured. I read the other day that in some situations, people in hospital beds who are ready to go out can't leave and go to a rehab facility because the insurance companies can't get the approvals done for that. So they're occupying beds that are desperately needed. This is a system which is in the process of disintegrating, and it's now, I think, very obvious that a major emergency change is going to have to be made so that people can get that off their minds and be sure that within the limits of the capacity to provide the care, that they can get care and that they won't be bankrupted, that they don't have to pay for it.
So our representatives are not done with the work that they have to do to protect people.
Oh no. They what they did this last bill was they responded to the pressures on them from their lobbyists and from their contributors, and they did a little bit of what they usually do in a slump. They threw some money at ordinary Americans, not in my view, the least efficient way to get this done, and then they said, "Gee, $2 trillion is a big chunk of change," which is not entirely false, But they did very little for the medical supply chain. They did nothing for the healthcare system. They didn't fix the problem of not being able to hold elections, that having elections have to go to vote by mail. There are many things that they didn't fix, and they've got to start working right now. And I hope working with a clearer mindset about what is required, and not following the same playbook that they followed with the third bill. The fourth one really has to be focused on the emergency and doing what the healthcare professionals say is necessary, doing what's necessary to protect the supply chain, doing what's necessary to get people to a place where they're secure enough to shelter in place without the kind of fears and anxieties you just described. Ireland just nationalized their healthcare system. They said, we're going over to a single system, a single public system.
When did they do that?
Oh, just about in the last few days.
Wow. Ireland has, you mean nationalized it like the UK has a national healthcare system?
Yeah. The Irish had a kind of a mixed system. They had private health hospitals and so forth. They've taken over them all. This is
all those Catholic hospitals in Ireland. They've just taken over the whole thing.
They have nationalized the hospitals in Ireland.
Wow,
that is correct.
And they had to do that because
that's the only way to guarantee the capacity will be there, to hope that the capacity will be adequate for what's required and that everybody has equal access to it.
Wow.
We're in a situation here where you look around Europe and you say, okay, what is going on in Italy? We have 3 countries that have provided aid to Italy, and they don't include Germany. They don't include the United States. The big one is China. And it was a team from my wife's home province of Fujian that flew into Lombardy, setting up facilities there. And there's a medical brigade from Cuba setting up a field hospital in Lombardy, running a field hospital in Lombardy right now. I mean, you can imagine, from Cuba, and one of the richest provinces, certainly the richest one in Italy, one of the richest ones in Europe. And the third one is Russia, which has been sending convoys of aid. Where are we? We're mired in a desperate situation trying to get our own act together, and mercifully, this is we've reopened channels of communication and cooperation with China, which has started yesterday sending plane loads of supplies that are critically needed in New York, Los Angeles, and other cities. They'll come in, and that's that shows you that we have to help each other. And we have to recognize that the benefit of being able to receive these things in the short run, and the necessity to make sure that we're better protected in the long run.
There's no way we'd be able to help Italy at this point now, is there? I mean,
no, of course not. No, there's not. But the fact is there are other countries out there that are doing it, and the reason they're able to do it is that they were better prepared all along.
Yeah. Should we call up Cuba and ask for some help? I mean, I know that's not going to happen, but you hear about
You're the expert on Cuban medical care. You probably know as much about it as any American. But
well, here's what I know. They are very happy to send. They train so many doctors. I mean, their goal is to have a doctor in every neighborhood, and it's the truth. I mean, they have an incredible medical system, medical schools, and they supply doctors throughout Latin America. I mean, I know any country you go to in South America, Central America, there are Cuban doctors there. They are the lifeblood of their systems. And, but I guess you can't bring that up now in this country because
I don't see why not. I mean, I'm sorry.
No, I know. I'm kidding.
People, but the reality is the reality.
Yeah, that is.
There's a Cuban field hospital in northern Italy at this moment.
That is the reality, and yet one of the Democratic presidential candidates, beginning with being asked that question by Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes about why would you say anything good about Cuba, and the candidate goes, well, because just like pretty much what your grandmother told you, if you can't say something nice about somebody, most people, even the worst people have maybe one redeeming quality. In this case, with Cuba, you have a number of things that they've done for their people, and then how they've helped other people. And well, anyways, it's simply a category error, a big mistake to project everything onto the leadership of a country. There's a degree of social organization and the professionalism in the Cuban healthcare system and in the Chinese healthcare system, and a priority to these things, which means, as you say, that they have enough of they have trained a lot of doctors and nurses, and they're able then to deploy as needed to deal with the health crisis of the whole population. There were, again, to come back to China, the case that we've been following closely from my wife's province, 1,200 medical personnel went into Wuhan, right into the maelstrom and pitched in. Mm-hmm.
And they're fantastic how brave these people are and how determined they are.
Very brave
to get it done.
Yeah.
And you don't have to like the Chinese government or the CCP or what have you to understand. This is an organizational capacity that any country under any system needs to have in order to deal effectively. And by the way, the United States has had it in the past. We were the most efficient country of the world at getting mobilized to fight the Second World War. And we were able to pull that together. And the reason we were is that we'd spent the previous decade of the 1930s building the infrastructure and creating a kind of national esprit de corps, national spirit, which meant could be mobilized in order to meet that challenge. We've become, the system that we've had in the last 40 years is very different from that system. So I'm not asking that we think about, importing something from some other country. We ought to go back to our own traditions and deal with it. I can tell you another story if you've got a second.
Yeah, please.
My father was involved in this. And he'd come from Canada in the 1930s. And in 1939, 40, he was working for the National Defense Advisory Commission, the Office of Price Administration, Civilian Supply. Right after the Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, 2 days later, there was a meeting to discuss critical materials, which, according to my parents, they went down the list alphabetically, which was very slow until they got to R. And then the light went on in people's brains and the word rubber came to mind. And of course, the Japanese were at Malaya practically by that point. And so my father left the meeting with a lawyer by the name of David Ginsburg, a very prominent lawyer later in life. And he and Ginsburg wrote an order banning the sale of rubber tires in the United States. And the kicker was they didn't work for the agency that had the power to enforce that order, which was the War Production Board. So they walked it around to the commissioners and they said, here's the rubber order, sign it, which they did, not asking who the people were who were asking. And they walked back to their office in this other agency and called the networks. And the next morning, rubber tires were not for sale in the United States. They were all conserved for the essential purposes.
It happened that quick.
Overnight.
So-
my
so
dad
that-
said he went by the service station in Alexandria, Virginia the next morning, and rubber tires were not for sale.
Wow. Okay. So December 7th is Pearl Harbor. This meeting takes place on December 9th.
That's right.
And by
So we're
what
talking
day?
Monday morning, the 10th of December.
By the 10th of December, they've shut down the rubber for tires because we need the rubber for the war effort. And by shutting down
and for essential purposes. I mean, it wasn't all for the war effort,
right? But that was the end of making cars. So,
oh yeah, then they put a stop order on cars very soon, and I think it was Ford defied the order and continued to produce 250,000 automobiles because they were profitable. And the government confiscated them, and that became the government fleet for the rest of the war. The other thing my dad did was he was responsible for a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit to save gasoline, and had to call the governors to. Two governors declined to enforce it. One of them was Texas. It was Papio Daniels said, "Professor, I understand what you're saying, but in Texas you go 35 miles an hour, you don't get there."
What happened to us? What happened to that kind of like? Boom.
Oh, it's still there.
We've got to do this.
I definitely believe it's still there. I can see it happening. I saw it. You can see it happening with the Javits Center being converted to a field hospital. There's a huge amount of competence in this country. The problem is it's not at the federal level, and not at the federal level in either party.
Yeah.
And that is what has to be changed. That has to be changed very, very quickly.
Now
you need to have recover the kind of administrative capacity and competence that you can see in mayors in cities around the country and in governors of both parties actually trying to do their best under these circumstances. But they're obviously at the top. We're being run into the ground by an oligarchy, and this was true in the 1920s as well. That's why Herbert Hoover couldn't get us out of the Depression. It took a change, and it took a powerful personality and someone who was prepared to reset the value system at the federal level.
So how are we going to make that happen? Because I think we know it isn't Biden, and some of us obviously we want Bernie, but the other part of the party isn't going to accept Bernie. So it may not be.
Yeah, I love Bernie, and I've supported him for 5 solid years.
Yeah,
in every way I could. But we don't have to. I think everybody really knows what's possible and what's not possible.
Right. Okay. So what does that mean then? What do we do between now and the virtual convention that's probably going to have to take place?
Well, people need to come to their own conclusions, But I think the first thing one has to recognize is that what we have coming out of this is not viable. And so once you do that, then I think fairly obvious conclusions present themselves. You have to ask who would be viable. That's a question. And how do you get from where we are now to the position of having someone who has capacity to handle this crisis?
Yeah, when you say viable, it's not just about who can get elected. It needs to be the person that can handle this crisis and take it like FDR did and beat it, win it, do whatever, and then come out of this come out of the collapse, come out of the the devastation of this in some way that we can rebuild, where people can rebuild communities, businesses, their lives, whatever it takes.
Sure.
Who is that person that the majority of Americans are going to, follow into battle to make this happen?
Well, so ask again, people need to come to their conclusions, but ask the question: who's on the front lines doing a good job right now?
Well, okay, so all right, let's just okay. There's the elephant in the room.
I think the answers to that are going to be obvious.
They're obvious. There are very obvious answers to that, and I'll be the first to admit that while probably the first person that's come to mind, this is somebody I haven't necessarily supported in the past. Doesn't necessarily share my politics, but I'll tell you, I've been and we are talking about the governor of New York. I am talking about the governor of New York. I've been so impressed because I am now quarantined. I'm here ensconced in New York City in the midst of this devastation. And, it's the only good moment of the day that you start to feel like something's happening, and somebody's going to make it happen. And, and maybe that, as California sadly is very soon now going to experience perhaps what New York has experienced, Gavin Newsom may step forward, and people will see that there's another person that is smart and can lead.
It may be, and I heard Governor Cuomo's speech at the Javits Center. I would recommend that everybody look it up on the ABC News site where I saw it was. Tell you people's values and their capacities emerge at this point in time, in this kind of situation. And I would argue that only someone who has who can persuade the American public that they are up to dealing with this challenge has any really serious chance of defeating the incumbent in the fall election. It just becomes the requirement for going forward in any serious way.
See, there are people right now listening to this and they're going, Mike, James, please, Cuomo has done a good job of, convincing Trump to help, to send things here, send the big boat, whatever. And if you're trying to imply that this may help defeat Trump, well, as he showed to the governor of Michigan,
Well, it's one reason why I'm not.
Yeah,
I'm holding back a little bit on. Because it's really a problem right now for the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
To understand that they have to make a choice of what their values actually are in this situation. They really, and the fact that this is not a beauty contest and it's not a question of whether you can make a television speech. It's a question of showing something much more profound and important, because the country needs to be led. It clearly needs to be led in an honest, capable way, and toward a set of values which preserve us as a country and as a society. It's nothing less than that.
So should I edit this part of the podcast out of the podcast? Because I'm afraid, Trump, certainly Don Jr. pays some attention to me, what I write on social media and what I do. And they've tweeted at me a number of times. So I'm aware that they're aware. And the last thing I want to do, because I just think that Cuomo has played this so well in telling Trump what he needs to hear. And it's kind of like all you got to do is just say the words, and it doesn't matter whether you mean them or not. It's just enough. And I
don't think you can judge what people really mean. What you can judge is how they speak to other people and how they, lots of things of that, what decisions they're making and how they're focused on the true issues in this problem in a way that reflects a grasp of reality and a capacity to manage these kinds of things seem to be what's important.
Well, yeah, but we know what that means. We know that there's one person who's in the White House who doesn't understand how to do this. Even if he wanted to, we all can see that he doesn't know how to do it. Like, put aside all your feelings, anybody that might have about the individual in charge. Once you realize, and I don't know if he's realized it, once you realize that, holy shit, we're in deep, deep trouble now.
Well, I think it would get us off track to engage in the conversation about the incumbent president.
Should I cut this? Should I cut this out of the podcast?
Yeah, I'm not. It's just not my priority. As someone who's trying to focus on what is required here, it's probably not necessary to draw me out on my views of this.
No, that's okay. I speak my own views. They're my views. I'll make that clear. I've never cut anything out. I've never filtered anything out of this. So I'll just say that these are my opinions and my feelings, and not necessarily yours, but you've made.
Well, I mean, it's just my priority at the moment is thinking about first of all, how you organize the economy so that you can get through this. It's clearly a long-term or a medium-term proposition, a proposition of months, not days. And it requires us to pay really close attention to the supply chain, as well as get the medical supply system up and running properly. Those are probably the most urgent economic priorities. and also to make sure that people have enough resources, including undocumented workers, including people who are low income, who are not tax filers, that they have enough resources to keep themselves safe and provisioned and that they're protected. I'll tell you an idea, by the way, that I think would be really important here and that deserves to be some airtime. That would be, and that is very easy to implement. Well, let the communications companies, cable, TV, internet, and telephone, provide their basic service for free for the duration of the crisis. People need to be at home. Their communications need to be assured. That would put some money in pockets in every household that has a smartphone or an internet connection. And that doesn't discriminate according to your legal status or anything else. And you just pay the communications companies to do it. That would be just one of the fastest ways to get some relief that would go out very far around the country and benefit low-income people proportionally much more than.
And what the government would do is the government would pay the
companies, just pay the bills.
Pay the bills.
It's easy.
And let
the bills.
Let people have free internet right now. Let them have the communication devices and systems.
Right. Absolutely. They need the communications. They also need to be at home. They need to be entertained. They need to not worry about paying a bill, and it would put a little extra money in their pockets. Simple, fast. It could be done overnight, and it would help. You obviously, you can cover the costs of other utilities as well, but those seem to me to be universal and extremely useful thing to do.
Yeah, why not do that?
That's why, by the way, we're thinking about how to provision people. It's much more sensible to this business of sending out money to tax filers. It's just a very inefficient thing to do. And now this one is done, but in the next move, it's not going to be adequate. The next move, the way to do it for most people, for people who are wage earners, is to, again, let the employers continue to pay them. They don't have to pay them 100% because people's costs are down. But the British are doing this 80%. The Danes are doing 75%. And then the paychecks continue to flow, and people don't have to file for unemployment, and they don't have to file. They don't lose their health insurance, and they can be called back when the businesses reopen.
So you keep the businesses somewhat open. Right. You pay people.
No, you don't keep them open. They're being paid to stay home. But as I say, what the business does is it continues to send out the checks. It goes to its banks. Tell the banks to give every business a 0% loan to cover that. And then the companies reclaim it from the government at tax time. It's an easy way to do it.
That's an easy way to do it. Yeah.
Many fewer employers than there are people. We know the government knows who they are because they all pay taxes. They all have a banker. It's just that's the way to handle wage workers. Doesn't help gig workers. But then you free up the unemployment insurance system so that gig workers can get on that.
Right. Self-employed.
So you're trying to keep people roughly in the same position that they were before, not to have a whole lot of disruption in their lives, not to lose the health insurance in the case of wage employees who are covered by their employers. And then you sort it out later on. But the government could do that, sending out things to tax filers. So you got a tax return from 2 years ago. People have had babies. Maybe they were in school in 2018, had a low income. It's completely, in many ways, it's going to be very haphazard. And of course, paper checks won't go out for weeks. If you don't have direct deposit, if you don't have a bank account, you have to wait for a paper check. And then you have to walk to the bank and cash it, or to someplace and cash it. Maybe you cash it and you have to pay a stiff fee for that.
Right.
It's a terrible way to proceed, and it should not be done again.
So your way would be just explain this again.
Many better ways to get people provisioned and again, we want to hold them in place, shelter in place, safe and secure. That should be the objective there.
So the government would give this no interest loan to companies.
No, the bank. You have a bank.
The
Just
bank
tell
would
the
give
banks. Yeah, the bank gets money from the Fed. The bank can extend that loan at 0% to the interest to the business, and so the paychecks continue to flow. And then every 3 months, the business tots up the bill, and the government writes a check. They pay back the loan. It's easy.
That's it. Wow. Yeah.
It's totally easy. I mean, it's just, and you only have, the number of businesses is a fraction of the number of people that you're trying to reach, and it flows through a system that already exists.
Give me another idea.
Yeah.
There's two great ideas.
It wasn't just, I have to say, this is not a partisan idea. Someone else who came up with it at exactly the same time as I did was Glenn Hubbard, who was the former chair of the council under George W. Bush. And I communicated with him. We agreed this is exactly the way to go. Right? People need to get over the idea that you don't work through businesses. Oh, and by the way, you don't exclude big companies. Half of American workers are working for companies that have over 500 employees. Do it with them as well. I mean, there's not a problem. If companies are shut down and people have losing revenue because they're not producing, let them get reimbursed for that part of their wage bill that's people are staying at home.
What about when we are no longer at home? We're out of the house. We can come back to work. How do we restart this? How do companies who have lost all this money, how do they, get, especially I'm thinking small businesses how do they reboot and bring people back?
Some of them, of course, are going to be protected by the bailout funds for a while anyway. But this is going to be a big problem because companies have lost their revenue, their debts are still there. And of course, many of them afterwards, as we're talking about this, are going to be in a different economic position. They're not going to have the same revenue flow through with respect to their fixed costs that they had before. Airlines have airplanes they have to maintain, and they're not going to have the passengers to provide the same level of revenue that they had before. So think about that and many, many other examples. Plus, on the other side of it, we're going to need, as I said, we're going to need a whole armies of public health workers and of people to provide the kinds of safety and security that we haven't had. So the structure of the economy is going to change, and we need to think about that. That's a problem that we can start thinking about a few weeks off when we've dealt with the first wave of problems, which, as I keep saying, we have to get keep the caseload to the below the point or at low enough so that the whole health system isn't totally overwhelmed. If we can possibly do that, that means the quarantines have to work. And to make the quarantines work, you have to have a solid supply chain that people have confidence in, and you have to have a safety and security in their home, which means people can't be evicted, they can't be foreclosed, they can't have their utilities cut off. Those are amongst the basic things that need to happen immediately.
I've read you for years, and one of the things I've really appreciated reading is how you talk about the myths of the free market, the free market system. The free market system will save us. It's the best way. It's so much better and more efficient than if the government did it or some sort of public system did it. And you've written really, I think, really important things about this. I just wondered if you'd share some of your thinking about that, because especially I've been thinking about this whole thing with, look, my grandmother worked on the machine gun assembly line at AC Sparkplug, which is part of General Motors in Flint, Michigan during World War II. And they turned that spark plug assembly line, making little spark plugs, into making machine guns in like nothing overnight. And this whole thing this past week with General Motors and the trying to get the ventilators and having them, and then whatever fight Trump got into them, which again, in my opinion, has a lot to do with the fact that it's being run by GM is run by a woman now, and the governor of Michigan is a woman, and so he picked a fight with these two women in Michigan. But here's the thing I don't understand. They tried to get this going, and it. Back in your dad's time, when they just took over the rubber industry, or they had General Motors start building planes and tanks and things like that, we can't seem to. We're just chasing our tail here. What is going on? What has happened? Because there was private enterprise back in the 40s.
Oh, sure.
It was capitalism. Why hasn't capitalism saved us in this moment? Why can't we make these masks, for Christ's sake? Give me your thoughts on this, because it seems that we are witnessing really right up front, up close and personal, how the free market has not only not saved us here, but is really in the way.
Well, what firms did, as they, particularly with a combination of free markets and globalization, was that they, and you know as much about this as anybody in the country, they outsourced. They went to cheaper sources. They got their various components, their parts, their source chemicals, and so forth more cheaply than they could before, and in some cases coming from very efficient, low-cost suppliers. I mean, I don't doubt that. So they were taking advantage of the opportunities that were there to cut their costs, and the result of that was that in many pieces of the supply chain are not present in this country, at least in the capacities that we presently need. That wasn't true in the 1930s. The world trade had collapsed. First of all, world trade had never been, industrial trade had never been extended to the global scale before the 1930s. It was industrial countries were industrialized, and the poor countries were suppliers of raw materials and tropical food products. So the world changed. We now have a broadly industrialized world in which there are low-cost suppliers who are critical to supply chains, and suddenly the supply chains buckled. I leave aside the Chinese case. India produces a great many generic pharmaceuticals, and when the crisis hit, they banned the export of a certain number of them because they needed them for domestic supply. And you can see the same kind of phenomenon all happening all over the world. In the case of medical masks, well, we were getting a lot of those from, guess where, from the city of Wuhan. Needless to say, when Hubei was locked down, though, that supply was not available. What the Chinese were able to do, and what we have not demonstrated the capacity, was to raise their production. So they had a lot of small firms, and the Chinese firms, these are not necessarily state-owned firms. There were 3,000 firms, I read, that went into medical mass production. And in 3 weeks, they raised the capacity from 15 million to 100 million. And I think the number is per day. I can't be entirely sure of that, but I think it was 100 million masks a day. In 3 weeks, 6-fold increase in capacity.
How'd they do that? How did they do that? Seriously?
Well, they have a lot. I mean, I can tell you, I have a son in Brattleboro, who his wife have a little business, which is it's a specialty product for transgender people. And they're converting right now into medical mass production. So I'm totally proud of them. This is Shapeshifters Limited of Brattleboro, Vermont. This was my son, his wife, and maybe 1 or 2 employees at the moment. Chinese had 3,000 of these firms. So they have a vast textile industry, right? They have a vast apparel industry. So they're producing clothing for the world. It's all cloth and sewing machines, and you get a pattern to make masks, and suddenly you're making them. It's not necessarily the high-tech virus-proof masks, but they protect people, and everybody in China is wearing them all the time. So they were able to move very quickly into a kind of mass mobilization to get the medical supplies that they need.
Are you saying it's because we don't have enough small businesses like that to do that sort of thing, or?
Well, it is. There are, in fact, it's, I think, relatively small scale compared to, obviously very small scale compared to what the Chinese can do. But there is a lot of self-organization going on as people try to throw what they can into this fight. But the reality is the society, which was organized closer to the foundations of the basics of what people need, was more resilient. And our society, which is, we do some things very well in this country. We obviously have dominated the software industry and the information technology and aerospace and those things. But we've relied on the rest of the world to keep us supplied with, for example, clothing. And it turns out that that's a capacity which has important uses. And we need to maintain, obviously going forward, we need to build sufficient internal capacity so that we can deal with the kind of crises that we're now dealing with.
You mean we need to be able to make clothes here?
Yeah, well, it's not saying we have to make all our own clothes, but we have to have some. You have to think about what your scenarios are for what's happening now. Learn from that experience, and and make provisions, which means that there's less for other things. But this is obviously where we've cut everything to the margins to the bone, and that's very efficient. That's what the market teaches you to do. That's what every economics class teaches you is the right thing to do: maximize profits, minimize costs. But it leaves you fragile. It leaves you prone to a breakdown, and that's the thing what we're seeing. And going forward, we have to think about how to share these capacities and how to make up for what is a lot of consumption things which we're doing individual households and so forth. We need to reorganize that so that we can enjoy a nice life, a good life, while preserving the social capacities that we're learning now that we don't have, that we're really scrambling to make up.
When we come out on the other side of this, and we will, I do believe that there is an end to this, but I would love it if there could be some sort of blank slate. I know it can't be completely blank, but I would love it if we could just, hey, you know what? We tried that for a few decades. It didn't work. Maybe there's a different way to structure this. Maybe there's a different way to think about how we do this.
There is going to be, on the other side, a fundamental choice. And the fact is that there are going to be people who've just been bailed out, people who sold short in the market. I read a Reuters story that certain funds had made a profit of $344 billion on the crash of the markets. So they saw it coming, and they got themselves positioned, and they reaped a huge profit. Now, what's going to happen is that everybody who owns a home or some other asset, a piece of land, is going to find they're in a down market. They're going to find that the value that they thought they had was much less. They're going to find that the mortgage payment they're going to be underwater with respect to their mortgages in a big way. And people are going to come looking for fire sale acquisitions. And so, your apartment building, your suburban home, your small business, all of that is going to be easy pickings. And if you allow that to happen, the country will become even more of a plutocracy, even more of a plantation economy. And I do not believe that the country will tolerate it. And so I think as a political matter, you're going to see a deep, let's just call it a fundamental choice that has to be made. In order to continue as a country that has a democracy, the country has a semblance of a middle class in which the broad population has some security, there's going to have to be a give on the debts. There's going to have to be a resetting of the financial system going forward. It seems to me that this is, we can't quite tell the extent of it at this point, but it just seems to me that the logic is pointing in that direction at this point. People need to be thinking about it.
You don't think people will tolerate, once again, their homes and being their mortgage being underwater again? To where
the mortgages will be underwater, and the question is, what do you do about it?
So what do the people who are listening to this do about it?
Let me again go back to history, because this was the fundamental problem of the Great Depression. People had debts that could not be paid, and they were tied up in knots. And it was also at the international level. The British and the French, after the First World War, owed the United States, and they extracted reparations from the Germans that the Germans couldn't pay. And the United States ended up lending to the Germans so they could repay the British and the French, and the whole thing was a big mess, and you couldn't get out of the Depression. It was a big collapse. It took years to get even a recovery started. Then when you got to the Second World War, households earned a lot more money than they could spend. They put it into U.S. government bonds, and at the end of the war, they all had substantial savings, and they didn't have debts because the debts had been wiped out in the Depression. And then we had a reset. And what happened after that? 30 years of reasonable prosperity, middle-class prosperity in this country. It was only after that broke down in the 70s that we started going back into becoming a country of debtors and country of people who are terribly stressed by all the various debts. And that is something which we have to face that is not going to be tolerable at the scale that's about to happen.
So, but after
therefore, should be changed.
Yeah. So we got into World War II. That was a big disruptor to the Depression.
It was a disruptor, but remember that half of the economy was being used to serve the armed forces, and so that was not something anybody could consume. And so people were being paid to do that work, to produce bombers and artillery shells and explosives and everything else that was being produced. and machine guns, as you say, and none of that was in the domestic market. So all that money had to be sequestered. So what did they do? They controlled prices and rationed certain basics. They controlled prices on practically everything. That was my father's job during the war for a year, 1942-43. Got the whole system up and running, and then they sold government bonds to the population so that you, instead of holding your income in cash or trying to speculate or trying to hoard commodities, you held a government bond, and it matured in the late 40s and the 50s. I remember having some my parents put into a little savings account when I was a child.
Yeah, the same for me. Right.
Yeah. I mean, these were Series E bonds, and so every family that had come out of the war had a more financial security in 1945 than they could have imagined in 1939. And that's essentially the story of why the system ran for as well as it did. And of course, we know that the financial system stayed regulated for 20, 25 years before it started breaking down those bonds and going back to what situation we've been in now, which is essentially a 1920s style of debt peonage for a lot of people.
So
we do have some.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, what is the 21st century version of what you just described? What happened in the 30s and 40s and 50s?
It's going to come on a much more compressed time scale, but the pandemic debts that are piling up will have to be wiped out. And then we have to restructure the financial system and then reset the distribution of income and wealth.
Who's going to wipe out the debts? Start with that. Who's going to wipe out the debts? How do we do that?
You wipe them out. You simply cancel them.
Cancel the debts.
Yeah. Of course you do.
So start by giving people an even footing that they can stand on instead of being crushed.
Sure. I mean, it's certainly no debt which is built up in the service of serving the world by staying at home in a public health emergency should be considered something that you have to worry about later on. I mean, people who are sitting home for 2 months and don't have any income and they have mortgages to pay and so forth. Those debts they're not going to make up that income. They're not going to have 2 months extra income in the third month when they go back to work.
But because they stayed home, that may have resulted in me living. So I want my government to make sure that they're not in debt, because that sacrifice of
that's right. Well, I would say they are allies in a war effort.
They're allies in a war effort. Yes,
and inter-allied debts need to be canceled. That's what got Europe back on its footing in 1953, the London agreements. The inter-allied debts were canceled in the London agreements. The German debts were canceled too, or were reduced very heavily.
So next year,
federal.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Federal Republic of Germany got back on its feet.
Right. Yeah. So we cancel the debts, right?
We're going to have to forgive a lot of debts going forward, for sure.
Okay. Step 2, after the debts.
Well, then you have to decide what you really need in order to have the kind of, as I say, the capacity to deal with this kind of crisis, which we clearly don't have now, haven't had. And so you're going to have to obviously you've got to have a public health system that functions and that people can use, and that serves their needs, and that doesn't bankrupt them. So the whole system of healthcare is going to have to be revamped. And then beyond that, I mean, there's a lot of things that we will need in order to have the kinds of capacities I mentioned. That simply monitoring and making sure that people are able to get tested frequently as they need to be, so that when there are future outbreaks, they can be dealt with surgically. That is to say, by isolating the people who are infected and getting them under control locally, rather than having to deal with mass shelter-in-place policies that we're doing now. Korea, by the way, has succeeded up to a point in doing this. And they've got some problems in Seoul at the moment, but they have mass testing. They did not go to a full-scale lockdown as they did in Hubei in China. The Chinese situation was really very, very grave, because in Hubei they were overwhelmed and they had to let people die in Hubei in order to save the rest of the country. So that's a kind of hard wartime decision that they made, but it did work. In Korea, they didn't have to make that decision, and they got the testing regime up, and so they're able to isolate. There's particularly a problem with particular churches in Daegu and some other special circumstances, and they're able to so far to keep it more or less under control. And that's where you want to go. And that way, most people live more or less ordinary lives, but you have a much more robust system for making sure that if things like this, and this is not the last RNA-based virus that humanity is going to see, are identified quickly and dealt with quickly, and that they don't become as disruptive and as deadly as this one is.
So the pandemic or post-pandemic is and should create a number of jobs that pay a decent wage.
Many, and it's those jobs, but it's also jobs that we have now. We have to understand how critical they are. You can't, again, I come back to the people who manage the food chain, people who pick, the people who ship, the people who pack, the people who sell, people who provide security and so forth. All of those have been very badly treated people, but they're absolutely critical frontline people right now, and they need to be absolutely both paid decently, but even more than that, they need to have adequate protections. You could go into a grocery store, certainly around here, and at least what I'm told is that you don't see that the employees have the protections they need. I know the Instacart workers are now on strike to try and get better treatment, but they also should have they need to have their medical care provided for.
Wasn't that one thing we should definitely fix after this huge medical disaster? Is that nobody should after this ever have to worry about their health care again. Period.
This is clearly a lesson. And the situation is such that if you have a large population, I know in Dallas it said there are 250,000 people who are uninsured and a lot of undocumented workers. I know in Austin the infection rates in the areas which have a lot of immigrant population that are higher, and people are afraid to go to the doctor. They don't want to be bankrupted. Maybe they don't want to be identified. They don't want to have their documents checked. And that's not just a tragedy for them and their families, but the whole community is inadvertently exposed at that point. So you have to have a system in which public health extends to the entire public. Everybody inside the borders has to have access to it. Right. It's not impossible. I say go to Britain, and I had an episode of passing through the airport, and they shipped me off to a hospital. I was all right in an hour and a half. They handed me a piece of paper with my name, with my address misstated. It said, James Galbraith has been treated and is discharged, period. I walked out and never saw anything more of it. It's not impossible to do that. No bill, no insurance, nothing. Of course we can do it. Yeah. British can do it. It's any other country can do it. It's the way healthcare is organized.
The plutocracy you referred to.
Right, I know, but I agree with that. And of course, it's been exceedingly difficult. You can talk about how the presidential debates, everybody was talking about what is Medicare for all going to cost, and on and on and on. This is, the world has changed in the last few weeks. People have to recognize that the system that we had has melted down. It's like a reactor accident. It is not reparable. It's going to have to be revised. The question is how quickly we recognize it, how quickly we move to do it. What we're seeing now is just going to begin to build as the bills come in.
You mentioned the debates and talking about Medicare for all. How come I haven't heard that question in the last month? How are you going to pay for that?
My friend and colleague Stephanie Kelton has just got a really excellent piece on that when she talked about her experience on the Senate staff, working for the Budget Committee, working for Bernie, and how every time she did something, so what's the pay for? How are you going to pay for that? And then, of course, what has been revealed with it to the tune of $2 trillion is that you don't need to pay for it. If you have to do it, you do it. Right. Whether this was the right or the wrong thing to do, it's certainly nobody considered, how to raise $2 trillion in additional tax revenue to fund a bailout or to fund the other things that are in that bill. They just put the money into the system. And the answer is that's because the government can do, because that's an inherent power of the Whether it's the wise thing to do in a particular circumstance is another question, but it's clearly a power. And what it reveals is that the fact that the water systems are not fixed in Flint, and the fact that everything else, that the roads and the bridges are in poor shape, and anything else that you want to talk about, it hasn't been done in this country. The fact that the public health system is withered, that is not because we couldn't pay for it, but because we didn't want to, because the powers that be didn't have the will or the interest. And that, of course, is we're now seeing the price.
That's very painful for you to bring up Flint as this example, because
sure.
I have a good friend who works at the Javits Center, and we, the whole city here in New York, watch the Army Corps of Engineers come in to the Javits Center. This is a convention center, and they do the auto show there. They do the boat show, right? They came in, and in 3 days, they said they were going to build a 1,000-bed hospital. In three and a half days, they built an almost 3,000-bed hospital. It was the most amazing thing. I hope somebody set up a time-lapse camera on it. And it really, you right away, you think, wow, we can do anything, can we? And I had sent like an open letter to the Obama administration back in 2015, asking the president, please send the Army Corps of Engineers to Flint. They've got to dig up these pipes, these water pipes. It's all poison. It's all lead. They got to dig up the main lines. They got to dig up the lines that go to each house. It just seemed like this is something the Army Corps of Engineers could do, and do just like that. In that case, and it would probably take a half a year to a year to replace the pipes in the city. But I studied other cities who've done it, and it's not impossible. You just have to have the will, like you said, and you have to make the decision that this is important.
And you have to have the people who can do it. And of course, as Governor Cuomo said when he spoke yesterday, those people are top shelf, and that's the spirit and the capability that we need to have in this country. And the people who can do that, and the people who really understand the public health issues, need to be given the authority and the resources to do the job that's required. And once we see what we can do, and the example you gave is just excellent, there's no reason why it can't be applied to a whole host of other things that have been neglected for such a long time.
That we could fix, and would provide employment, and would do all these things. What is wrong? I keep saying this. What is wrong with us? What is wrong?
This is what the New Deal did. The New Deal was a massive construction project that it gave the Old South a new life. It electrified the country, in a literal sense, electrification. And we don't really understand the extent to which we still live with the fruits of that New Deal. I'm sitting here in Austin, Texas, and we have electricity that comes from the Mansfield Dam. That was a New Deal project. We have these lovely lakes those dams were a New Deal project. We have the University of Texas main building. That's a New Deal project. We have museums that are New Deal projects we have the San Antonio Riverwalk just down the road is a New Deal project. There's vast things, and it's also art and music and photography and writers. We supported a lot of people doing useful things. So that model exists in American history, and it's the right thing to think about as we think about what happens once we get the immediate crisis under control.
There was a New Deal project in the town I live in Michigan, a WPA building, and it had sat vacant for a number of years. And I thought, that would make a nice little community theater. And so I led the effort to set up this nonprofit, and I had already done it to one theater, and I did it. I built, kind of remade this thing. I had a bunch of friends there. Into a theater, and saved this old Roosevelt funded building way in northern Michigan in the middle of nowhere. And yes, so much of that still lives with us. Friends of mine who sign up for Medicare, they're reminded of that. Would we even have this if it weren't for that?
And it's an inspiration for the world. The New Deal did, in addition to the physical things, it provided social insurance, Social Security, provided unemployment insurance, deposit insurance. It provided the minimum wage. It got the unions organized through the National Labor Relations Act. It really gave us the structure of life that made the middle part of the 20th century successful. And that's why out there, when people are talking about the great challenge of climate change, it's the Green New Deal. And people think about green, but the New Deal part is a very important thing. I have to say, I organized a conference on New Deals in Europe and America just here in Texas in November. And that's up on the website at the LBJ School. And so a lot of people who knew quite a lot about it, including some very wonderful people from the New Deal Preservation Association, the Living New Deal. That's a great website that people can understand just exactly how America came to be what it is now through the work that was done by the WPA, the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Yeah, my dad was in that. He built state parks.
Every agency you can think of, sure.
He was a worker, 19 years old, building state parks in Michigan with CCC.
Right around where you are, the Triborough Bridge, the Lincoln Tunnel, those are New Deal projects.
Wow. And you mentioned your father a couple of times here. And so if you don't mind me bringing him up, I
don't mind at all.
Okay, good. He is or was, of course, the great John Kenneth Galbraith, and he, my cousin, her dad was a state assemblyman in New York City, and they were the New York part of the family that we didn't know that much, but they would come to Michigan every summer, and then every other summer we'd go to New York, and her father was part of Roosevelt when Roosevelt was governor in New York. It was part of his, team of Democrats, and I remember hearing your father's name at a very young age because my cousin Patricia just had all this history from FDR and after the war and all this. She was born in 1946, but as a young child, your dad's name would come up, and so I was just as a curious 8 or 9 year old, I was always trying to pay attention to this sort of thing. And of course, your father was still alive then, and very active in these things now that, man, what did we do? Take it for granted back then that we got to this place now, the income inequality. You've written books about that, all these things that, if your father were alive today, if he were here to help, what's the thing he would do the morning after the Pearl Harbor that we're in the middle of right now? What's the inspiration we need to take? The thing that you or I or anybody listening to this needs to do tomorrow, the next day, next month, whatever it is, because like you said, we don't have a lot of time here. We have to act very quickly right now in the short term to save lives, and in the longer term to rebuild a crumbled society in some sense that people are saying, oh, it's going to take 10, 12, 15 years to do this rebuilding. I'm thinking, oh my God, we don't have 15 years.
Yeah.
I'm just channeling his thinking and the good graces that you got to be raised by him. What a blessing that must have been. I say that, maybe he yelled at you at dinner every night. I don't know.
Well, it was
cut your hair, James. Cut your hair.
I have no complaints about it. But let's. If I had to think right now, what would be in my father's mind? I think it is those crucial moments at the outbreak of World War II, when he suddenly found himself responsible for one of the most important pieces of the U.S. economy, which was to prevent inflation and keep civilians supplied in a steady way. And I would argue that he would probably say that not only do we not have the time, but we have the capacity to move at once. That is, we understand what needs to be done. People fall together into a mobilization not only of resources but a mobilization of spirits that a spirit of solidarity and a purpose, then in a very, very short period of time, the situation will begin to change. And I don't think we have to look back to that moment, but it's clear that that's an extraordinarily important moment in American national life and national history. My father was privileged to be a part of it. But we can look around the world where we can see that where people did come together with a sense of public purpose and did what was necessary to everybody pulling in the same direction and doing their part, including simply staying at home and observing the quarantine so that you don't transmit the infection. Then you can begin to bend the curve. You can suppress the virus. You can get control of it, and then the pressure will come off of the terrible pressure on the doctors and nurses and medical staff will begin to ease, and you can begin to get some things into a position where you can start to say, okay, how do we best manage both the situation going forward and how do we best reorganize?
And leadership.
It requires an understanding that there has to be a common purpose and there has to be an understanding of it. It is possible to do these things if you do them quickly and with a sufficient social force amongst all of us.
And the leadership that we need.
That's leadership is one thing, but I actually don't think that's the essence. I mean, leadership is important. Leader needs to voice what needs to happen, but it really is the response of the people that is
right. Because we're not going to wake up tomorrow morning and we're not going to have an FDR suddenly.
No, people need to understand what they need to do. They need to listen to the authorities who do speak the truth, and we do have some. We have. I think everybody has come to admire Dr. Fauci, and people have other people who we've mentioned. I think everybody has come to admire Governor Cuomo and other governors, and I've certainly come to admire my local officials here, who are just working as hard as they can and staying in touch with their constituents. So this is all, as I say, there is capacity, but it's really us. It's the public, the American public, the world public, that needs to pull together.
I agree. Well, this has been amazing talking to you, and I, we're all looking for some sort of hope right now. I'm looking for realistic hope. I don't like false hope or something just so I can feel better. I was going to ask you how back, just a few years ago, you wrote a book called The End of Normal. Of course, you didn't have this in mind when you wrote that.
I wish I had. You always wish you'd studied some things that you didn't study. It's certainly been a rapid education for me. But on the question of hope, I can come back to an expression that our friend Bill Black is very fond of, and I've often used it as well. I learned it from him. It's the expression that goes back to William of Orange. It is not necessary to hope in order to persevere.
Wow.
It
is not necessary
perseverance
to
is
hope.
What we need. We need determination. We need solidarity. We need organization. We need capability, and hope will follow. Hope is what comes when we know that we're pulling in the right direction. Then you get a spirit.
Wow,
that's what distinguishes real hope from false hope, if you like.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I needed today. So thank you for that. How are you feeling? Are you holding up okay? Your health is?
Oh yeah, I have to say I'm in a household under extremely good discipline and control, and it's not mine that's responsible for it. I'm exceedingly grateful for the family support that I have right now. It's just
right.
My wife and my daughter are here, and we're good. We're certainly
everybody's good, and everybody's inside. Basically, right?
everybody's basically inside. My wife goes out once a week, and she knows the protocols. She's been studying them carefully. So we're doing our bit here. And I have to say, I have three other children who are not here. One of them is out on the front lines in Portland, trying to raise money to support service workers in Portland, Oregon. He's a cook. He's laid off. Obviously, his restaurant is closed. My trans son up in Vermont is making medical masks, and little business with his wife. And my daughter Eve, who's a musician, has been shopping for people, but also she's been composing some wonderful music in her own little house and space in South Austin, and making that available. So everybody's in my family. I'm totally proud of my children.
Well, you must be. Wow, that's incredible to hear. And I look forward to that test that's coming out where it's going to be able to tell you whether maybe you've already had it, that you're already maybe immune, from the virus. As soon as I'm told that I'm good to go, I want to go volunteer somewhere and just pitch in, whatever it is I can do. I think a lot of people feel that way. I'll look at all the retired doctors and nurses that have come forward to volunteer and all of this. That does give me some hope that my fellow human beings, my fellow Americans are still very good people.
There's no question that they are, and that's really makes one understand who and what really is important in life.
Yeah.
And so if that spirit prevails, we'll be in good shape. I think there's there'll be some rough passages to getting to that point, but you can already see it. You can already see it as people really do understand what dedication and professionalism that so many people are showing, and just in their basic continuing to do their jobs under enormous stress. It's amazing to me.
Yeah. Well, listen, James Galbraith, thank you for this. No, I really appreciate it. And please stay well. People like you, we need you. We're going to need you, especially when we come through this and to build that society.
And it's a wonderful experience talking to you. I meant to say I appreciate it very, very much.
Well, I'm honored. Thank you. And thank you to all of you who've listened to Rumble here today. I think we know what we have to do. And I know a lot of people are already doing it. So thank you. And we'll talk to you all tomorrow. Thank you.